we're asking people first, for each of these, for positive emotion, engagement, etc., how important are they in your life? So we ask people actually to put their own beta weight, their own value on this. And then part two of this is, in the past week, how many hours did you spend on each of these things? And what we're doing is trying to subtract your ideal weighting, what you want, if you will, from the way you actually live. And we're asking questions like life satisfaction, depression, and the like. So within an empirical framework, there are ways of asking the extent to which, for, in your view, a life satisfaction target, the extent to which living your life around your values or failing to do so results in happiness or unhappiness.
Yeah, I think that's a good piece of information. Then people can make a more informed choice.
Oh, and by the way, I wanted to mention that in terms of Ken's bubble, that it doesn't matter to me what's in the bubble, Ken. You can still look at the splits within the bubble and ask what the relationships are.
Valerie?
I guess I do want to say one thing about the value stuff. The point that I want to hang on to, the most important point to me, is that the concept of well-being, insofar as it's not a concept that lots of people use actually in common parlance, but insofar as that's the name that we've given to that thing that the ancients talked about, something like flourishing, where it's the goal of life, the end of life, it's the thing that makes life worth living. It is a normative concept, and that means that at the very highest level of abstraction, the theory that you have of what that thing is, or we could call it a definition of what that thing is, it has to describe something that's plausible as playing that role, something that, that's plausible as the thing that is the end of life, the goal of life, something that we can recognize as such. Now, depending on what kind of theory you have at that most abstract level, it might, so on my view, to just fill it out a little bit more, you have a very abstract theory, and from that abstract theory, you can derive a substantive list of what the, and I don't care what we call them, we could call them components, we can call them causes, the way Ken wants to, it doesn't matter to me, but we have a substantive list of measurable items. Whether that substantive list is value-free depends on what the abstract theory says. My own view, because the abstract theory has values built into it, is that some of the items on the list are going to be also normative, but you don't have to take that view. And even on my view, I suspect some of the items on the substantive list are purely empirical, and I think that's true of happiness or let's call it subjective well-being. So it seems to me subjective well-being, as defined by Ken and Diener, is something that people value, and it's justified as a well-being either cause or ingredient or constituent or whatever you want to say. And I think probably that is something we can measure purely empirically. But if what you want to talk about is the goal of human life, you're going to need to talk about more elements than just that.
So may I comment then on that? You've really convinced me about something, but it's different from what I think you wanted to convince me about. I think certainly the phrase "a life worth living" is suffused with value. So I'm going to give that up and say that this is, whereas the words well-being and flourishing, I want to say, are not suffused with value. Now here's what I mean by that. In my very crude reading and memory of Aristotle and other great philosophers, it seemed to me that program was too ambitious. So many people know this better than I, but I think Aristotle wanted 3 different problems to be solved in one fell swoop. I think he wanted happy, good, and true all to be solved in one fell swoop. Now, I think these are really very different matters. And what I'm proposing, to use Ruut's language, is a theory of happiness, not a theory of good or a theory of true. So on, and you're not going to like this, but on the theory I'm proposing, a perma theory which just looks at what the individual's weights happen to be, Osama bin Laden can be flourishing. A lot of, as best I can tell, he's got a lot of positive emotion. He's really engaged in this task. He's got tremendous meaning in the sense that he is attached to something enormously greater than he is. Apparently has pretty good relationships. And, trade towers, he accomplished quite a bit. So on a perma analysis, he's doing just great. Now, I happen to thoroughly disapprove of Osama bin Laden, but not on well-being notions, on reasons external to the theory, which have to do with goodness and truth. No.
Can I say something really quick? So I'm actually with you on Osama. We agree about that. I don't approve, but not on well-being grounds. But so the thing I would like to insist on is that you do actually have an abstract theory, which is the theory of uncoerced choice, and I think that's a normative theory. Why uncoerced? Why add that? Why talk about choice? So there is, it might be that once you've got that theory settled, the implications of it no longer are suffused with values. But at some stage, I think.
Good. So the very first move is value-laden.
Yeah. Right.
First of all, it was interesting. I in a sense, accused Marty of lumping, and he turned that around on me very nicely, but validly, that I'm wanting to say well-being is one number and what predicts it, and he's saying we need more than one number. And I would actually agree with that, and I like the dashboard approach, and I would say let's measure the degree of need satisfaction of people, of countries. Those are dials that ought to be on the dashboard: autonomy, competence, relatedness. I think the main thing is I'm not sure you would need positive affect on the dashboard because from my theoretical perspective, which might be wrong, you know what positive affect is once you know the three needs, whether they're being met or not. But that's a fairly minor quibble, I think. The other comment I wanted to make is that I totally agree that we are more moving into the future than driven by the past. As a goal researcher, I'm very interested in what people are trying to do. Going back to my mentor, Bob Emmons at UC Davis, who invented the concept of the personal striving back in the 1980s. And I have this concept of self-concordance, which I didn't talk about today, but the notion is when you select goals to pursue, you might select the wrong ones that don't concord with your sort of deeper nature, your deeper traits, your deeper developmental trends. It's a very difficult skill to know what goals to pick and pursue. And a lot of times people pick the wrong goals, and even after they get them, it doesn't make them happy. So it's very important, since we are creating the future as we go along, that we pick and try to create the right one.
I'm just curious about something, and this isn't a question for anyone in particular. I guess it's more for the psychologists. I was just wondering about, it seems pretty common to incorporate positive and negative affect and life satisfaction in what you're trying to get at. And I was just wondering if there could be any kind of double counting going on. So take, for instance, kind of two parts to this, but one part is that there are parts of my day, perhaps, where I'm just kind of engaged in my daily activities, and then there are parts of my days where I'm thinking about my life and I'm feeling pretty poorly or well about how things are going. So my kind of moment-to-moment affect measure is going to capture some of these attitudes about how I'm satisfied with my life and how well I think my life is going. So if you're measuring that and you're also trying to capture positive affect with these, I know that sometimes they try to get these kind of momentary assessments throughout the day, could there be some double counting? And the other question I had related to this is, it seems to me that some people are less reflective about their past or about their future, about their life as a whole than others are. Some people are obsessively concerned with their life globally, and other people may not think about it too much. So I'm wondering if For the individuals who don't think about it too much, does it matter as much as far as your concerns go? And should it be the case that people who don't care as much about the global view of their life, that it should be weighted equally as someone who thinks about it all the time? Because even those people who don't think about it a lot, when you ask them, what do you think of their life, they may say, oh, well, now that I think about it, I don't like it too much, but it may not be something that concerns them on a daily basis. So.
I guess I'll address the double counting issue. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, but we can ask these well-being questions at any time frame that we want. What's your mood right now? What was your mood today, in the last week, the last month, overall in your life? And it kind of depends on what research question you're looking at. But certainly your global judgment of, like if I said, how satisfied am I with my life, it would be affected by my mood that day. And that's actually a bit of a measurement artifact from one perspective, and you might want to control for that. So maybe that's what you mean by the double counting. Let's see, what was the second question?
Yeah, well, there's also another kind of double counting. If you take how people feel, their mood, which is measured by these questions, and typically mood over, say, the last month or year. And you also ask them about their life satisfaction, then there is a kind of double count, at least in my view, that overall life satisfaction draws on both how you feel and how you compare. Now, in the case of the use of Dina's satisfaction-based life scale, that's not really a problem, because these questions are very cognitive. They are very much, did your life bring what you want? So when you combine them, then actually you get a good estimate of overall happiness.
So I'm going to comment on the deeper part of the question, but I should say on the superficial part of the question of double counting, there are 5 people I can actually see in the audience who know more about regression and analysis of covariance than I do. But in general, the superficial part of your question is there are methods for eliminating double counting by asking for common method variance and eliminating common method variance. A little too technical to do now, but the simple questions of double counting are statistical and manageable. But the deep question, I think, is if you use methods in which I beep you on your Italian vacation, and I ask, how much are you enjoying it, or hedonic questions, and at moment 1 you say, well, I just got bitten by a mosquito, 3 out of 10, and a few minutes later or a day later, I've got diarrhea, 2, and on. And then at the end you ask people, how was your Italian vacation? They tell you, even though the moments might be 2, 3, and 6, they'll tell you something like 7. By the way, this is probably not true of Asians, but it is true of Americans and Europeans by and large. So what's going on between the experiencing self and the evaluating self? Now, this is a really important question, and the famous colonoscopy experiment, do you know that? That's basically, you give people this awful bowel procedure, and what you're going to look at is how do they rate it, and then the likelihood they'll come back for another one. So in one set of procedures, you give them 30 minutes of this awful procedure, and the other set, you give them 30 minutes, but then you add on 3 more minutes. But in the 3 minutes, what you do is you decrease the level of pain. So you basically got more total pain, but it ended not too badly. So it turns out when you do that, people in the second group are more willing to come back for another. So their evaluation is very different from the integral under the curve of moment to moment. Now, this is one is very important theoretically, but also if you're in doing public policy and you want to know whether or not to build a park, the question is, who should vote, the moment-to-moment self or the evaluating self? Do we vote our moment-to-moment well-being, or do we vote our cognitive evaluation well-being? I don't think the answer is no. So I think you raise a very deep question.
I have a question. About setting the beta weights for national policy. If we're going to have the goal of national policy to be increasing well-being, under what beta weights would that be?
Yeah. So I think, one, I don't know, so I'll just sort of reflect on it for 30 seconds. I mentioned what we're trying to do with individuals. We're asking, hey, what are your beta weights for each of these things? Well, one can in principle do that for a nation or a zip code or a constituency and the like. Now, the problem is that the error range of the beta weight is going to be vastly greater for a nation or a collection than individuals. So then the question is, to do public policy for a nation or a group, well, it says that in general, if the beta weight on relationships is very high, you want policies that facilitate good relationships. But you also have to speak to the whole range somehow. You've got, the whole range votes. That's what a democracy is. So you have to take into account the mean beta weight, the standard deviation, and the range. And I don't know how to do that.
Marty, I'm glad you mentioned the Kahneman, what I call the all's well that ends well study. I showed to my class a couple weeks ago Kahneman's TED lecture about the experiencing self and the remembering self.
Oh, I haven't seen it.
Well, in effect, what he's saying is most psychologists who study well-being and happiness studying what we remember about it. And he seems to be arguing that what we really should study is how we experience happiness, which is a very much more daunting strategy. He said these have nothing to do with one another. And then I had to go on and give a 2-hour lecture on all the research based on remembered happiness. It felt kind of silly. So my solution will be not to show that lecture anymore. But I wondered what the panel thought about this. I mean, I don't think they're completely different things, but they are distinguishable, and much of the research we do with surveys is, of course, about remembered happiness. Just wondered what your reactions to that were.
Well, for practical reasons, we have to do a lot with remembered happiness, and I would really get nervous if our ratings of remembered happiness would be very different from average moment assessment over a long time. And that evidence I haven't seen yet.
Did in that lecture, did he talk about the married with children issue where, but I think it's relevant, that if you beep parents just during the day when they're hanging out with their kids, when they're with their children, they're less happy. But if you ask them to make a global judgment about the quality of their life, they think it's great. So I think there can be a mismatch there between the actual stress of dealing with this, but you get something out of it at some global, more meaningful level that still makes you at least think that you're happy, even if you're not.
No, it's different. This is different in the case of children. If you ask people what makes you happy, then they say, well, my children make me happy. If you follow them moment by moment, then you see that the moments they share with their children are not the best. Not to say that they are very unhappy, but typically they are more happy when they're absorbed by their work. And if you look at general life satisfaction, then indeed we see that people who get children tend to get a bit less happy. So in this case, there is a correspondence between the time sampling and the average estimate.
Have you guys asked people? Has anyone asked people what they care? Has anyone asked people what they care about? Whether they care about the moment-to-moment happiness or they care about the long term? Because when I heard the results of the colonoscopy study, I thought, I'll get the longer one then, if I, God forbid, ever have to have anything like that. Not if you're female, really. Anyway, I thought to myself I'd rather have a better memory. I'd rather retrospectively evaluate the experience as less bad.
I think the answer to Valerie's question is no, but I think the married with children is really an important example. And I think it basically exposes what's wrong with happiness theory. So first, if this were a basic fact about human choice, none of us would be here. That is, we would choose not to have children.
No, I don't think so. Because we are not all full-time hedonists. We want to be happy, but we also want other things. And a lot of people know that having children is not the road to heaven, and still they do.
Exactly. So what I want to say is if we have a theory of human choice, and what we take seriously is PERMA, then it might turn out for positive emotion or for life satisfaction or for happiness that having children isn't a very good idea. But on meaning and relationships and accomplishment, it's a terrifically good idea. And so I think the fact that we have children and are parents, in spite of even knowing that changing diapers isn't much fun, and in spite of knowing the whole integral of having children just on positive emotion isn't as good as flying around the world having gourmet dinners. The fact that we have them, I think, shows that PERMA is a better theory of human choice than the final common path of happiness or life satisfaction.
So I sense a peculiar aversion away from utilitarianism within this panel, even though it's arguable that the activism of taking the intervention to the institutional or national level already assumes that it's a good and moral thing to increase the general population's wider well-being. So I wonder if anyone wants to comment on the reservation against utilitarianism or the modified prioritarianism and such.
Now, I can comment on several reservations against utilitarianism, creating greater happiness for a greater number. One of the arguments is that can go against other things that we value. And, well, if we take the example of Brave New World, that is an imaginary situation where people are very happy, but at the cost of their autonomy, at the cost of their freedom, and their, well, stupid consumer slaves. Well, if that were true, then there would be a high price for happiness. And it's an empirical question whether that's the case. And that's something well, social science brought us closer to the truth. The case is that there's no such thing as depicted in Brave New World. Rather reversely, happy people tend to be more autonomous and also are happier in conditions that allow more autonomy. So there's no conflict between happiness and freedom in this case. And actually, research has not yet showed any such conflict. There can be, it can exist, and maybe such conflicts exist in particular situations, but as yet we see synergy between happiness and other things we value rather than conflict.
What about Hazel Marcus? What about Hazel Marcus's work?
I don't understand.
Hazel Marcus's work, a psychologist. Do you want to explain?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Well, she was here not long ago, and I'm sure you're familiar with her work showing that some people, particularly some Asians, prefer heteronomy over autonomy.
Prefer?
Heteronomy over autonomy.
I can comment on that, because that's a critique that is often made about self-determination theory and its emphasis on autonomy. And the usual SDT reply to that is that if you define autonomy the right way, and it can be a little subtle, then everybody wants and profits from it. it might be that what Hazel is thinking of when she thinks of autonomy is independence. And SDT, self-determination theory, insists on making a distinction between independence and autonomy. Independence is, I don't rely on you, you don't influence me, I'm apart from you. And it's certainly true that there's less of that and less enjoying of that kind of experience in East Asian cultures. But there's a lot of data, a lot of cross-cultural data. I just published, I actually have a 23 culture data set where in every single culture, feelings of autonomy measured the way SDT measures them predicts happiness and well-being.
Could I go back to the utilitarianism question? Just to follow what Ruut said, I was actually surprised to hear you say that you perceived in the panel an aversion to utilitarianism. So I think if utilitarianism is the classical view that you have a hedonistic theory of the good and what we ought to do is maximize pleasure, you're right that there's probably universal aversion to utilitarianism. But if you're thinking of a sort of more newfangled consequentialist view according to which one ought to promote as much well-being as possible, where well-being could include a number of different elements or at least have lots of different causes, then I suspect there's not terrific aversion on the panel to that kind of consequentialist view. Though I don't know how people feel about maximizing. That's kind of that question would need to be answered. But at least I think people would be quite sympathetic to the idea that we should produce more, and yeah.
Two comments, one on the relationship of freedom and choice. I think choice plays a larger role, not a necessary condition, but a larger role when you deal with the positive side of life, strength, virtue, meaning, than it does on the negative side of life. So one wants to pay particular attention to choice when you're working on the positive side of life. And one comment on utilitarianism, as I understand it, I think, Valerie, PERMA at least is indifferent to utilitarianism. That is, if you're measuring PERMA and you're a government, you can decide all you care about is PERMA in London, or PERMA in a given zip code, or PERMA for poor people, or PERMA for rich people. So it seems to me it's a measurement strategy that's indifferent to the question of whose PERMA you're going to maximize.
So I have a question or a comment on Osama bin Laden and Aristotle. So I ran a study to test whether people are operating with sort of Aristotelian conception of happiness, meaning that whether they are willing to attribute happiness to others depends on their sort of moral evaluation of that other. So in one of my studies, I had two stories that people were randomly assigned. In the first, a Nazi working in a concentration camp was described, and he was said to be deeply fulfilled and satisfied with what he was doing, sometimes feeling a little bit bad about being around the suffering, but on the whole, he wants to continue engaging in this and judges that it's an important thing to be doing. So in the other story, other group was randomly assigned. The only thing that was changed was that being a Nazi working in a concentration camp was changed into being a Red Cross doctor working in a field hospital. And so also said to be deeply fulfilled and satisfied, sometimes being uncomfortable being around the suffering, but also judging that it's an important thing that he wants to continue doing. And so the people they were all asked the same question: do you agree with the statement he is happy? And so the people who got the Nazi story tended not to agree, and the people who got the Red Cross doctor story tended to agree and attribute happiness. And so let me just quickly describe one more study. Here, everyone got the same vignette about Bruce, who had been a churchgoer, but now had instead adopted a gay lifestyle, and sometimes having some feelings of guilt, but on the whole judging that this was the kind of life he wants to live, and has also recently found a man he wants to share his life with. So in this study, everyone got the same story, 3 questions in different orders, different for people. So do you agree he's living an immoral life? How much distress do you think he's experiencing? And also, do you agree he's happy? So here again, distress attributions predicted some degree of variations in happiness, but couldn't explain the whole range of attributions, whereas the morality attributions, the people that tended to attribute immorality also said he's not happy, and so the people who said it's morally fine were happy to attribute happiness. So that might be taken to show that the way that ordinary folks go about attributing happiness to others, or maybe themselves also, does depend on sort of moral values and not just psychological information. So I was wondering if you could sort of comment.
I think I've got it, Sven. The question is, what does this show? So I think your conclusion is correct. It shows something about the way people use the word happy, and that Aristotle was right in what he was trying to describe was I don't know what the Greek that you've accurately captured how people use the word happy in English. Now, that's not the question I'm asking. So I'm saying, well, let's say we had people judge PERMA, how much positive, et cetera, where flourishing or well-being is just some combination of those elements. There, on my view, you get the Nazi and the Red Cross worker would be identical.
I would just want to add, I actually think, given the way philosophical theorizing proceeds in ethics for the most part, that folk intuitions are relevant to what kinds of theories are defensible, but they don't carry, I'm not sure how much weight they carry, and there are other desirables in constructing theories of these notions that might compete against your results. And I've thought a lot about that first study that you mentioned after I read your paper, and I'm still not sure which way it goes about the notion of happiness, whether the need to have the need to explain different concepts. I mean, we do need a concept for the psychological thing, and in the literature, happiness is that concept. So there's some reason of simplicity and elegance to divide things up that way. And I'm not sure. I think the folk intuitions are important, but not decisive.
And at the back of my mind for choosing a word like flourish, which has no real meaning in English except for plants, was so as to remove it from the ordinary language use of the word and not using the word happy.
I just wanted to comment on that. That's actually a debate that has occurred quite a bit at Rochester, where self-determination theory is originated. Can there be, can the Nazi Guard be truly self-determined and happy? And to me, your findings say that people have an intuition about positive human nature, such that the Nazi Guard can't really be happy. And that's a case where the person is probably self-deceived. And Valerie, you were talking about, having a place to consider self-deception in just the purely subjective judgment. And that's where I think it seems pretty apparent that there must have to be, or likely is, some self-deception in that person involved in that terrible scenario. I'm not sure about
I really don't see why philosophers would want not to separate the good, the true, and the happy. Why these can't be completely separable issues.
Well, I think Osama's a harder case because what he's doing is very meaningful. But still, I would imagine people would say he's not as happy as he thinks he is, and I think they might even be true. They might be correct in saying that because he's involved in mass murder. essentially. And he's got an ideological rationale for doing that, but at some level, some part of him, I would suggest, ought not or isn't comfortable with that, but has to believe through cognitive dissonance reduction that it's all peaches and roses.
That's very hopeful.
Ask you, how is thinking you're happy different from being happy?
There are certainly people who are self-deceived about happiness. It's a good question. To me, what that is, it's measurement error. So you could find, okay, the person who thinks they're happy but they're not, you could uncover that and reduce that error by including what their friends think of them. And their friends would tell you, oh, yeah, he's really kind of miserable at a deep level, but he's denying that.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is where it's useful to have different concepts, because the way I'd be inclined to answer that is that you can't be deceived about your happiness, but you can be deceived about whether your happiness constitutes or contributes to your well-being or your flourishing. That's how I would want to go conceptually.
And the way I'd phrase it within PERMA is that your own judgment of positive motion is dispositive. Nothing else counts. So you can't be deceived about positive emotion. About relationships, meaning, accomplishment, those require, for good measurement, combinations of subjective and objective variables. So if you tell me your relationship with your children is very good, I want to know what your children say about it. Lincoln, who was a profound melancholic, and many times thought his life was meaningless, and that's because mood contaminates, as the other people have said, judgments of meaning. But we know Lincoln's life was enormously meaningful by objective criteria.
I have a question for all of you, I guess. I was wondering whether you had any thoughts on whether happiness is achievable for everyone. It seems to me like it would be really unfortunate if it weren't. The thought that there might be some people born into the world and they just can't even... So actually I'm more worried about well-being than happiness, I should say. And we've already seen that different places in the world, you've seen... so geography and the conditions of places you were born would make a difference, but also the talent that you're born with, your intelligence, how you can accomplish things, and maybe your social talents, so what relationships you can have, and even values. It seems like there might be a lot of moral luck there in whether you were born into a place that gives you kind of the right values as opposed to other ones. So I was wondering how big a role, luck and other factors determine whether or not you're able to achieve well-being and whether everyone is able to achieve it.
Well, I think that you should take the analogy of health. Some people are born in a bad body and are prone to be sick and die early. And it can be in their genes, it can be in the environment, and that's the same for happiness. Part of our happiness is genetically determined, and there's also strikes of good and bad luck, but there is also a part which you can achieve. And these components, from what you can do and what is given by the situation, differ across situation. You can say that happiness is 50% genetically determined everywhere, but you can say that is, at least in our kind of society, about 30% of the difference in happiness that exists is genetically determined, and that also, I guess, about 10 to 50% is due to good or bad luck. And then there is a range that we have more or less in our own hands, not only individually, but largely collectively.
Well, you've hit on one of my central moments for working on PERMA rather than happiness. And so happiness in the sense of being bubbly and cheerful and merry is Gaussianly distributed. And that means half of the world, 3 billion people, not really feeling very good right now. And as Ruut mentions on happiness, there are fairly substantial genetic constraints. And kind of the best you can do if you're a therapist is to get people to live in the upper part of their set range for happiness. So basically, a happiness view of well-being consigns half the world to a hell of unhappiness. But I think that's a bad idea morally and scientifically. If you take meaning, on the other hand, I don't think there are genetic constraints on meaning. I think meaning is everyone's birthright and can be achieved. There's more freedom to achieve it. So part of my motivation for not being a happyologist is the issue of making well-being much more accessible to all human beings.
A comment. I don't think that happiness is normally distributed. I think by default we are rather happy, and in the right conditions we can be very happy. And you've seen the data on how long and happy we live, with about 60 years in a country like Switzerland. Well, never in human history have we lived such long and happy lives. And so there is a lot of possibility, and we can raise happiness. And using PERMA, that is one of the right means. Just as we have extended our healthy lifetime using scientific research in the health area, we can do the same thing in the area of positive psychology.
We could start by all moving to Denmark or Switzerland.
Too many philosophers there would depress.
Okay, I'm from School of Education, and I always thought that the positive psychology should play a much more important role in K-12 education. We teach them science, we teach them history, but we don't teach them how to be happy or how to have a good quality life, and I think that's very important. So I wonder if you can comment on what role should positive psychology play in K-12 education, and what kinds of efforts are making in that.
Yes, so I'm vitally interested in exactly that. So I've argued for a concept of positive education in which we continue to do literacy and numeracy, but at every level of education we teach about good relationships, about life satisfaction, about meaning in life. And in fact, K through 12 curricula, we began by developing curricula just for middle school, but now K through 12 curricula have been developed in various settings for how to teach the skills of life satisfaction in addition to workplace skills. And in last I saw, I think 21 replications around the world, there is evidence in different grades that you can do this. So I don't know a lot about Montessori. From what I hear, that sounds like it moves in the direction of teaching PERMA kinds of skills as well, but I'm just ignorant about it.
So Aristotle's been mentioned a few times. I'll ask an Aristotle.
Could you come closer to the microphone?
Sure. Is this better?
Yeah.
So there's a classic question about how we translate eudaimonia in Aristotle, whether this is happiness or whether it's flourishing or whether it's well-being, and not just as a linguistic matter, but as a conceptual matter. What is it that he's talking about? And that's been mentioned a few times here. If we mean by happiness what pretty much has become the common denominator here, it's pretty clear that he doesn't mean that, because people can be mistaken about judgments of eudaimonia. But there's a defensible reading, whether this is the right reading of Aristotle or not. There's a particular reading that eudaimonia is one activity It's the use of the intellect to contemplate God. And why is that eudaimonia? Well, eudaimonia is the activity of the virtue, or if there's more than one virtue, the most complete and perfect of the virtues. Our intellectual activity is the most complete and final of the virtues, he thinks. Contemplating God is using that virtue to contemplate the highest possible object. Another consideration that I think is lurking in the background, the gods for Aristotle are the paradigms of eudaimonia. And especially the prime mover. And what does the prime mover do? He contemplates himself. So that's the paradigm of eudaimonia within that worldview. Now, if that reading of Aristotle is right, then what in the world is Aristotle talking about? Is he talking about well-being and he's just mistaken? Is he talking about something else that's not well-being, like perfection? Is he talking about a different kind of well-being, but not the kind that we're talking about here? And more generally, I guess the question is, what role do historical and cross-cultural investigations of what people mean by well-being play in the kind of disputes? We've had some considerations here about sort of what the best definition is for the basis of empirical research. We've had other questions about sort of what makes life worth living. But in adjudicating these issues, what role do we give to historical and cross-cultural comparisons?
That's a really hard question. So let's see I feel obligated to answer it as the philosopher on the panel. My sort of gut feeling is that that interpretation of that interpretation of Aristotle and eudaimonia, I find it so far out of the realm of viable options that it seems to me like he is talking about something else. Though I think among the ancients there were some pretty wacky ideas about what eudaimonia was. The Stoic ideal to me seems a little wacky, but yet not as far out of the domain of what makes sense as the view that eudaimonia is contemplating God. But I don't know if that's just a matter of my, that could be just my limitation. So I'm not sure what to say about that interpretation of Aristotle. But I've been sort of persuaded by Julia Annis on the translation of eudaimonia as happiness, and that this actually would support Sven's position that the folk intuitions kind of matter to how we define these words. But Annis thinks that we ought to translate eudaimonia as happiness because that's the only thing that can make sense of the common project that the ancient moral philosophers had, and that moral philosophers throughout history and to the present day have when they talk about happiness. So I don't really have a dog in the race about how to define happiness, but I do find Annis's view persuasive, that eudaimonia is sensibly translated as happiness, and that makes me even more inclined to interpret Aristotle not as to interpret that view of Aristotle as not a view about eudaimonia. And to think what Aristotle thought eudaimonia was virtuous activity in accordance with reason, and that other stuff is kind of an anomaly, or you have to say something about why he said that other stuff later in the ethics.
I also think it's a very hard question, and I have no opinion about what Aristotle meant, and wouldn't venture that. But I think there's something behind your question that I do have an opinion about, and that's the, if you will, the absolute versus relative nature of well-being and perma, and does this change with time and culture and background. I have to say that Nansuk and Chris Peterson's work shows something really startling about universality that I never would have predicted. And I think it bears on the question of whether or not, right now I think in our culture, every parent wants their children to have perma. We can all say yes to that. But then the question is, did people always want that? Did Aristotle's contemporaries want that? So here's this shocking finding that Nansuk and Chris have found. So there, in our work on strength and virtue, there are 24 of these things. Doesn't matter for this what they are, but they're things like kindness, gratitude, fairness, self-control, modesty, zest. And there's a rank order in the United States. So it's trivial that the way we came about this classification is we looked across time and space, and so it's trivial, tautological, that every culture that we know of and every background has these words for these things and wants that. So that's not the issue of universality. Here's the shocking thing. So we asked of 83,000 Americans, I think that was the number, what's your rank order in self-description of these 24 things? And among Americans, number 1 is kindness. I think number 2 is gratitude. Number 3 is fairness. Number 23 is modesty. And number 24 is self-control. And that's the rank order. So then Chris and Nansuk asked, well, we've got enough data on about 60 other cultures because so many people have taken this. What is the rank order in other cultures of this? Now, there's no prediction about what the correlation should be, and as you probably know in psychological research, when we get a correlation of 0.35, we hold a celebration. The mean correlation across the world of the rank order is about 0.80. That is to say, it's identical. Uzbekistan rank order falls on China, which falls on Australia. So that suggests that, so the extrapolation now is that suggests that in dealing with these positive matters, we're not dealing with something that's completely relative.
I found a similar thing focusing on life satisfaction, and there is now a lot of correlational research on what correlates with life satisfaction, both on the individual level and what social conditions are conducive to life satisfaction. And here also the universality is the rule.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, I'd like to throw up a scenario for you. Suppose there's a country that you guys have been wanting to send researchers into, but haven't been able to for whatever reason. The name of this country is Hatfield-McCoyistan, and it's divided into 2 ethnic groups, the Hatfields and the McCoys. And you send researchers into the Hatfield ethnic group, and you find out that on all the levels of PERMA, they score very high. That's because they have great meaning in life, because their meaning is to destroy the McCoys. They're engaged in that process. They have very strong bonds among each other. And then you send researchers to the McCoys and you find the same thing, that they're also score very high on PERMA. And then you find something quite troubling. They have read your book. And one reason they score very high on these PERMA is because they've studied and they've taught their teachers to teach their children. And I'm wondering, this seems to be a plausible outcome of what you're saying, because you're saying that PERMA is value neutral, and you seem to be content with that. And I'm wondering if you're content with this scenario.
If the content is just what, Brian? I didn't hear your last closing
I'm
phrase.
wondering if you're content with the scenario of essentially what we would consider a radicalized but happy society.
So I think I heard 2 elements in your question. One is, do I really want to say that the Hatfields and the McCoys have PERMA? And the answer is yes. But I condemn people killing each other and feuding and doing revenge on an entirely other set of grounds, politics, ethical, and the views of what would happen to the human future if that. So it's a different set of grounds on which I condemn it, not within the theory. So it's the Osama bin Laden example, as best I understand it. And the other part was the reading the book part. Now, I'm not sure you really intended that as part of the question, but I do mean that reading the book, having philosophers, psychologists talk about the possibility of flourishing and happiness raises the bar of human existence. So I'm not at all unhappy if the Hatfields, the McCoys, and everyone else finds out about this, because I think it raises human aspiration just to know that happiness is possible.
I also wonder, Marty, if you might reject the empirical plausibility of the example, given what you said yesterday about PERMA increasing peacefulness.
This is some of Barbara Fredrickson's data, which are worth talking about. There's something called own race bias in the recognition of faces. And so if you take black faces and white faces, you can actually morph them with pixels to get intermediate faces. And there's some own race bias is that you tend to recognize difference if you're a white person among white faces, but all the black people look the same to you. And that's and conversely, if you're black, you see the differences among black people, but all the white people look the same to you. So what Fredrickson then does is she makes people happier, and it gets rid of the own race bias. And there's other data on altruism to suggest that when you increase at least the positive emotion part of life, that people are more peaceful, universal, it widens the moral circle. And so I think what Valerie is suggesting is that if PERMA really worked, then the Hatfields and McCoys would stop feuding.
On that happy note, sorry, I'd like to thank Martin Seligman for a wonderful lecture. I'd like to thank our panelists for a very stimulating morning's discussion, a wide variety of interesting positions. I'd like to thank the organizers of this, Louis Lowe, whose tireless worrying is responsible for much of the good organization of this. Maureen Lopez and Judith Beck, who provided essential staff assistance, which is to say did most of the work. And I'd like to thank you for your participation, your patience, and your wonderful questions. Thank you.